All right, Alexander, let's do an update on what is happening in Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine, what is happening on the front lines. What is going on in Kursk and what is going on in Donbass? Is Kursk still a catastrophe for the Ukraine military? I believe the Russian military said they gave an update on casualties, and I believe they said 50,000.
Yeah.
In Kursk. It is a catastrophe for the Ukraine military, but it looks like Zelensky continues to double, triple, quadruple down in the Kursk direction. Meanwhile, in Donbass, it looks like the Russian advances are accelerating. They're getting very close to Pokrovsk, Chasov Yar, the Dnieper, the south of Donbass. Well, what's going on in Ukraine on the front lines?
I think more and more people are sensing that we are now entering, we are actually entering, in military terms, the endgame, that Ukraine's ability to sustain itself is almost exhausted, and that it's increasingly unlikely that it can get through this year. I think that's the first thing to say. Now, I say that there's been an astonishing editorial in the Washington Post that says exactly this. It doesn't want a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. It wants, to keep Ukraine to keep fighting, which is extraordinary. I mean, it really is. The way they phrased it, the bad peace is worse than, well, presumably Ukraine's defeat. But they said straightforwardly in the article that Ukraine is losing men faster than it can replace them, that Ukrainian society is exhausted. And they also said that the figure that the Ukrainians are citing for their casualties of 400,000 is greatly understated, which is the first time, by the way, I've seen that admission in such an important mainstream newspaper as the Washington Post in the United States. And bear in mind, this is an editorial. And as everybody knows, the Washington Post gets information from the intelligence community. So I think this is the way I read that editorial is it's preparing us for the fact that Ukraine is now entering an end game, a death agony, if you prefer, because that is how it looks across the front line. Now, it is very interesting because the way the Russians conduct military offensives are completely different from the way the West conducts military offensives. If you go back to summer 2023, when the West took over planning for Ukraine, the West's idea of a military offensive was that you focused on a particular position, which you believe is the weak position. You pile in all the men that you can there. You attack on a narrow front and you try to break through. And this is very much based on American Western ideas of gaining control of territory, outmaneuvering the enemy, seizing control of cities, doing all of those kind of things. As we discussed right at the beginning of the war in a program that we did, the Russian state have a different model. They set out to destroy the enemy's army. So instead of focusing on an attack on a narrow front, they attack right across the front. They gradually, steadily increase the pressure until the enemy army just completely disintegrates. And we are now getting very, very close to that point. Let's start with Kursk. For reasons known best to himself, Zelensky and Sirsky as well decided to launch a counterattack there, despite the fact that we've had report after report about how tired and exhausted and demoralized the Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk are. There was a counterattack. It sought to capture a village called Bolshaya Soldatska. Nobody really can explain what it was that the Ukrainians thought they would achieve if they captured that village. The offensive failed completely. It opened up gaps in the Ukrainian lines. The Russians have pushed through those gaps. They've captured a whole set of other villages. The Russians appear to outnumber the Ukrainians in manpower, and they massively outnumber the Ukrainians in equipment in Kursk. They are now within a kilometer and a half of Suja itself. This is the small town that the Ukrainians captured, which is their main their main trophy, if you like, from their Kursk offensive. It looks like the Kursk pocket is imploding, and the losses have been catastrophic. The Russians say 50,000 dead and wounded, maybe. What we can say is that the equipment losses have been prodigious, and Putin, of course, has claimed, and he claimed some time ago, that they were greater than what Ukraine lost in the 2023 offensive. But that's Kursk. Everywhere else, things are going from bad to worse. Kurachovo, one of the most important fortified positions Ukraine had in southern Donbass, it's been lost. The Russians have captured it. The Russians are rapidly encircling Pokrovsk, the city we've been hearing about so much. A bit further to the north, they've cut the main roads there. It doesn't look as if Pokrovsk can be defended for very long. The Russians appear to be, they might even have by now actually captured the other important fortified town of Toretsk. Chasov Yar, there is still fighting going on there, but nobody believes that it can hold for very much longer. And further north still, the Russians have crossed the Oskol River. They're apparently increasing their their bridgeheads there. This is the area where Ukraine launched its counteroffensive back in 2022 in Kharkiv region. It looks like it's going to lose all those gains. But the most important thing, the two most important things are these. Firstly, the Russians in the Pokrovsk, Kurachovo area are now getting very close to the river in central Ukraine. I saw the first article, I can't remember where it was, that finally acknowledged the fact that central Ukraine, this area of central Ukraine near the river, is Ukraine's heartland. If the Russians enter it, if they reach the east bank of the river here, let alone if they capture Zaporozhye and Dnipro, the two big industrial cities, it is a terminal blow for Ukraine. I mean, the country, as we know it, ceases to be viable. And they are getting very close to that point now. And the other thing, so that is a major strategic problem for the Ukrainians. And their army is just dying. It's dying on the battlefields. Even the Ukrainians are admitting this. And there is no simple way around this. They cannot keep reinforcing it. Many of the soldiers who they do conscript desert almost immediately. And even if they were to keep all of those soldiers, apparently would still not make up for the losses. So the Russian strategy, as we said, is to destroy the enemy's army. And they're now very close to achieving that objective as well. The Washington Post clearly doubts that Ukraine can keep fighting for another year. The BBC had an article about a week ago hinting at the same thing. We are, as I said, at the first moves of the end game.
What do you make of Kellogg saying that he's going to need 100 days to get to some sort of a negotiation with Russia and Ukraine? Given the pace of Russia's advancement and the pace of Ukraine's collapse, would things be in a critical state for Ukraine and for the collective West 100 days from now? I mean, the picture today is already very bleak for the collective West, for NATO, and for Ukraine. In 100 days, it's going to be much worse. We could realistically see Russia having control of Toretsk, Chasov Yar, and I don't know, maybe a significant part of Pokrovsk. Is that possible?
Absolutely.
We could also maybe see Ukraine out of Kursk in 100 days.
Absolutely.
That's also possible.
That's also possible.
So what does this mean then for Kellogg's 100 days target?
Well, first of all, the problem with Kellogg The problem with the whole peace initiative that he has launched is that it has come far too late in the day. If Kellogg had been launching a peace initiative of this kind, or if the United States had been launching a peace initiative of the kind that Kellogg is trying to get off the ground in 2022, 2023, there might have been some point to it. The trouble is, the Biden administration turned its face against all kinds of diplomatic contact. It always said, we'll be with Ukraine for as long as it takes. We'll give them unlimited support. We won't negotiate with the Russians without the Ukrainians, giving, as I said, a Zelensky veto over things. So Kellogg comes along. He says, I need 100 days. He doesn't have 100 days. A year ago, he would have done. 2 years ago, he would have had 100 days. He doesn't have it anymore because, as you absolutely rightly say, well, Toretsk is likely to pass completely under Russian control in the next few days, not 100 days. I mean, it's probably the next couple of days. I don't think Chasiv Yar is going to be far behind, actually. In Kursk region, it's frankly difficult to see the Ukrainians holding out for very much longer. They might be able to hold on for another 100 days, but I mean, the amount of men and resources that they would burn up in order to do that would be horrific. And if the Russians break through to the river, then, as I said, which they might do over the course of the next 100 days, well, Kellogg goes to Moscow and he's in an impossible position. Now, this is where we come to, why is he talking about 100 days? Could it be that this is coming from Trump? Trump is telling Kellogg, look, I'm giving you 100 days to sort this out. If you can't, I'm walking away. Because that would make a lot more sense than seriously thinking that he can negotiate something in 100 days.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Look, I mean, to be fair, you're asking a lot for someone to sort this out within 100 days as well. I mean, even if he had preparation beforehand, we now know that his thinking of Ukraine, his preparation, given the reports he was putting out, was completely faulty, and it was based on collective West sources and the Ukraine Ministry of Defense and their information, the UK Ministry of Defense, the collective West media. I mean, his idea, his conception of resolving the conflict in Ukraine, Kellogg and Fred Fleitz, was completely off base. I mean, it had no basis in reality, most likely because they were buying into the collective West narrative and the collective West information, which we now know has been completely false and misleading.
Absolutely. I mean, we've discussed this many times. I mean, at the time they wrote their report back in April, we were in the stalemate narrative, that the war was in stalemate. And that was the narrative that was cobbled together after the failure of the 2023 offensive. And we said at the time it wasn't true. But of course, many, many people believed it. Kellogg and Fleitz did, and they wrote that article on the basis of it. There was no stalemate then, and nobody, I think, believes that there is a stalemate now. So he's working from an out of date
Exactly.
position.
Exactly. I was going to say the same exact thing. So basically, to be fair to Kellogg, I guess I'm trying to be fair to Kellogg. I'm saying he now has 100 days from working from a realistic, with real information and facts as to what's really going on to find a solution in Ukraine. And he has to basically scrap all of the lies and misinformation that he was buying into over the past 6 months.
Yes.
And that's tough.
Absolutely. I mean, I should say something else. I mean, what Kellogg also needs to do in order to preserve his own reputation is he needs to talk to Trump and to the others. And there really needs to be a proper congressional governmental investigation into what went wrong in the United States about this, because the intelligence failure has been of epic proportions. The things that had been said, which have turned out to be untrue, have been extraordinary. Congress has been given the wrong information time and time and time again. Remember back in April when they signed off on the last appropriation, it was going to be enough to keep Ukraine going, and they would be able to stabilize the front line on the basis of the military supplies that they were going to receive. And all the problems before had been because Congress hadn't provided any funding, and now that problem had been solved. Well, as we saw, actually what has happened is that since the appropriation was made, the Russian offensive has accelerated. So it's every stage, the American people and arguably Congress have been misinformed. So I mean, this really does require a proper investigation and report or something about. Of course, whether that will happen is an entirely different matter. But Kellogg, in his own interests, for his own reputation, really needs to explain it, and really perhaps ought to lobby for it, because he was deceived along with everyone else.
Well, that's why it was a grift.
It was a grift.
Yeah, exactly. Final question. Zelensky is saying that that Ukraine could possibly have elections by May. Possibly. That's an early date, but that's what he's saying. And the reports are that he wants to run for re-election as president, and he can win. But he's got one problem. These are Ukraine media reports. His one problem is Zelensky. And the reports are from Ukraine media that Zelensky is floating to Zelensky a carrot and stick offer. If you stand down and don't run against me as president of Ukraine, which would guarantee, this is the way Zelensky sees it, it would guarantee my victory, then Zelensky, I will give you a seat on whatever ministry you want, or I will make you Speaker of the Parliament. What do you want? I will give it to you. Just don't run against me. The stick part of his deal is that if Zelensky does decide to run against Zelensky, then Zelensky's going to bring up an investigation and charges against Zelensky for what happened in Kherson, the loss of Kherson to the Russian military. How does this tie into everything that we're talking about, and what do you make of these reports? Do you think these are accurate reports, or not?
Yeah, they probably are accurate reports, because what I think Zelensky is now becoming increasingly worried about is the collapse of his own political position in Ukraine. I mean, as the war turns increasingly bad, he wants to secure his own position, because currently there's big question marks over whether his position is constitutional at all. Putin is saying all the time that it's not, and that he's not really in a position to continue as president of Ukraine. And Zelensky must be worried that the Americans, Trump, might eventually come to the same conclusion if he decides that Zelensky is the problem. So Zelensky wants to hold some kind of election in which he is re-elected in some way, so that he can cure this problem of his own, arguable illegality. But the problem he has is that he's not particularly popular in Ukraine anymore. And so what he wants to do is he wants an election, but he wants to be sure before the election is held that he's going to win it. And the only way he can do that is by buying off his opponent, which is what he's trying to do with Zelensky now. He's trying to buy off or threaten Zelensky to make sure that Zelensky doesn't stand. I predict he will do the same with other people. Klitschko, potentially, Poroshenko, if Poroshenko really is interested in standing. All of those people, he's going to try and buy them off or threaten them to prevent them standing, which will, of course, mean that it won't be if it happens, it won't be a real election at all. It will just be another performance intended simply, as I said, to make Zelensky's position in Kiev look a bit more secure than it is. I mean, nobody should take this very seriously. It's just Zelensky, as I said, trying to reinsure himself in the face of problems. The war is being lost. The Americans potentially could be turning hostile. There's question marks over his legitimacy. So at least he wants to sort those out so that, as I said, he can keep challenges away. That, I think, is actually Zelensky's biggest priority now. It's the most important priority that he has is to retain control in Kiev. It's more important to him than what happens on the battlefront. See, just saying.
Self-preservation. No.
I just want to add one quick thing. You mentioned about, that it was a grift. The whole Ukraine thing was a grift. The person in the Pentagon who was apparently in charge of sending all the weapons to Ukraine has just resigned.
Yeah, resigned.
Just saying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. Yeah, and Ukraine's democracy. This whole story about Zelensky and Zelensky really does resemble EU democracies.
Absolutely.
When you take into account what they did in Romania and everything they do when they hold their elections. Actually, the way Ukraine runs elections is pretty similar to the way the EU meddles in member states' elections.
Do you know, I have a suggestion for a new job for Zelensky after Ukraine goes down. He should be elected president of the European Commission. He should be Ursula's successor. He is he's so expert in European methods that he was the ideal person to run the commission after he's lost his job in Ukraine.
It might happen too.
It might even happen.
It might happen. All right, we will end the video there. The Duran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, Rockfit, and X. And go to the Duran shop, pick up some merch like what you are seeing in this video, what we are wearing in this video update. A link to the Duran shop is in the description box down below. Take care.